Balancing your glucose levels is like laying the foundation in your house. It is, without a doubt, the number one place to start. Without steady glucose levels, you can't really do much.
90% of people who have prediabetes, which is probably about 1 out of 2 Americans, according to the conventional criteria, which I think are not strict enough, have prediabetes, 1 in 2 Americans, and 90% don't know they have it. And I would say the real data is probably more around the 93% who have it, both people who are overweight, which is 75% of the population, but also those who are thin, but we call metabolically unhealthy or metabolically obese, normal weight, or thin, skinny fat, or TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. So you can be thin, but metabolically unhealthy. And all what we're talking about today matters to every single person listening, because the biggest killers on the planet, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia, all are regulated by or caused by or worsened by problems with your blood sugar and with your insulin levels. So we're going to get deep into that today. How would you know if your blood sugar's out of balance, if you're having spikes? What are the symptoms? You alluded to that with, a person who wanted you to move in with them. But what is actually going on in the body, and what is the symptoms people experience that can give them a clue that, oh, maybe this is me and I should pay more attention?
Okay, anybody listening, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Do you ever experience cravings throughout the day? Now, most people are going to answer yes in their head. Yeah, never. Are you ever more tired than you wish you were? Do you need coffee mid-morning, mid-afternoon? Do you go to sleep but you wake up and you're just lethargic? Those two are, to me, the most obvious symptoms that you might have blood sugar imbalances. And that's just the beginning mark, because then, studies are showing us the links between glucose spikes and brain fog. So when your glucose is on a roller coaster, the information between the neurons in your brain goes more slowly, and that can be felt as brain fog. Blood sugar spikes increase inflammation in the body, and that can lead to psoriasis, eczema, rosacea, inflammation in your joints. It can impact your hormones. So maybe you're going through the menopause and your symptoms are quite difficult. Maybe you're, younger than that, but your period is all over the place. Maybe you're trying to have a baby and you can't because you're not ovulating anymore. So, those symptoms often point to the fact that you should probably figure out if your glucose levels are steady or not. And then long term, as you said, cancer, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, those are very clear signs that there's something going on in your glucose levels. And to me, Mark, balancing your glucose levels is like laying the foundation in your house. It is, without a doubt, the number one place to start. Without steady glucose levels, you can't really do much. And in conclusion, I would say, if you're listening to this and you think you could feel better than you currently do, then 100% figure out if your glucose levels are unbalanced and start there. And then you can start layering on more stuff. For me, I started with glucose, but then I added so many more things. Exercise, sleeping in a dark, cool room, going to therapy, emotional processing, but if I didn't have that baseline of steady glucose, I didn't even have the energy or the brain clarity to go after those next steps.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. I think people think, oh, well, I don't have diabetes, or I don't have prediabetes. Like, why should I pay attention? Like, why does it matter? And why is it important for everybody?
Well, because even if you don't have diabetes or prediabetes, don't you want to prevent it? That argument kind of upsets me, because I even hear, medical professionals say, well, they don't have prediabetes, they shouldn't care. I'm like, yeah, but how do you think you get prediabetes? So whether you're in the 1 billion people in the world who have type 2 or prediabetes, or if you want to put it into remission, or if you just want to avoid getting it, it's very important to learn these principles. To me, these are things that everybody needs to know, because today our food landscape is very difficult to navigate. It's full of starches and sugars everywhere. We're pretty lost as to how to eat and what to do. And so we need these principles to guide us, to make sure we don't end up with metabolic syndrome, with full-blown type 2 diabetes. So everybody should care, everybody, whether you want to feel better today or tomorrow.
Well, I agree. And I would argue that most people are on the spectrum. It's not just like one day you get diabetes or one day you get prediabetes. There's a whole continuum of changes that happen over decades, starting even when you're a little kid. that actually put you in poor metabolic health. And so catching that earlier than later is really important, because the changes that we see fatty streaks in the arteries of like kids from cholesterol deposits that are often related to blood sugar imbalances, right? Because kids are eating all this sugar and processed food. So it's not something you have to wait till you have a problem. I'm very curious about what happened once you wrote this book, and what you discovered and what the reception was and what people found as they started to track their own blood sugars. Because, you did this as self-experiment on yourself, where you tracked your blood sugar, everything you ate, you track what happened. You're not an obese, unhealthy person, but you still learned so much about yourself. What was it you learned so much from writing this book and from getting the feedback that you got for it?
Well, Mark, and the reason I got into this was simply because my mental health was super out of whack, and balancing my glucose levels helped me create a baseline of health in my own body and my own brain. And then I started realizing all these studies showing, as you said, that this matters for everybody, for cravings, for sleep, for hormonal health, for long-term prevention of Alzheimer's. I mean, like, it's really, really important. And so when I wrote Glucose Revolution last year, I was trying to give everybody everything I had seen in the scientific studies on the topic of glucose levels. And so it contained, these 10 hacks about simple tools you can put in place in your daily food habits to balance your glucose levels and feel better. And so the reception was very good. But I started getting a message from people, Mark, in my Instagram, my DMs. A lot of my readers sent me this very peculiar message asking me to move in with them. They were like, Jessie, they were like, I understand the science. I think I'm having glucose spikes, because they were recognizing all the symptoms in themselves, and they wanted to do the hacks, but they wanted me to move in with them and actually help them do it. Because a lot of us know, Mark, that we have to eat better, exercise more, but really what's difficult sometimes is just actually getting started. And so, I pondered, can I move in with all these million people? No, I can't. So what can I do to address this issue? And so that's where this new concept for this new book came out. So the Glucose Goddess Method. I took the 4 most important principles, in my opinion, to start steadying your glucose levels, and I turned it into a very simple 4-week plan. And again, I really want to help people just start, because that is often the big friction point. People had bought my first book and they wanted to do everything, but they didn't know how to start. They didn't have like the recipes. They didn't have the step-by-step guide. And so this method really is like me moving in with you and guiding you for 4 weeks to steady blood sugar and to incorporate 4 fundamental principles to help your body and help your mind.
The other thing I kind of want to dive in with you a little bit about is what's normal. Because when you go to the doctor, you get your blood test, you check your blood sugar, and your A1C maybe. You're lucky, they usually don't check that. Never check your insulin, which is probably the most important blood test to check on your levels of blood sugar balance. What should the normal level be? What should the optimal level be? Because normal, is up to 126, but that's not, normal. What are optimal? What's the optimal levels of sugar before and after eating?
Well, listen, fasting wise, it appears that you should be under 85 milligrams per deciliter fasting. I don't know what your opinion on that is, but definitely the 100 cutoff is way too high. And, if you're at 99, you're not okay. You should be like, okay, I'm like 1 point away from prediabetes. You should be having a look. But the studies point to the fact that after 85, problems start happening and symptoms start worsening. Do you agree with that number, 85?
Absolutely. Based on a large Israeli study, they looked at glucose levels and cardiovascular risk, and they looked at after about 85, it was a linear progression to increasing risk of heart attacks and death. So it didn't start when you were 100 or 110 or 126. It started like at 85. So that means at a fasting level, you probably should be between 70 and 85. I think that's probably the range that I would agree with. What about after you eat?
Well, so the guidelines say that you're normal if after eating your glucose levels doesn't spike above 140 milligrams per deciliter. But again, that's really, really high. And studies in people without diabetes are showing that actually you should probably be striving for an increase of less than 30 milligrams per deciliter after eating. And that cutoff of the 30 milligrams is what I call a spike. So if you look at my Instagram graphs, you'll see like that's the line at which I say, okay, you're going into the red. Now, obviously, the objective is not to just try to flatten your glucose curve at all costs and have a perfectly flat glucose curve, because that could be achieved by drinking a lot of wine, eating a lot of butter. There's things that keeps your glucose levels steady that are not necessarily good. So the concept is, how do we reduce the variability wherever you are, even if you have type 2 diabetes and you're spiking, super, super high after eating? How do you get that down? How do you just reduce the spike height and the drop height and the drop depth of your glucose roller coaster? That's really the point.
Yeah. Well, I think, obviously we know in medicine, if you're over, 140 after a glucose tolerance test, that's considered type 2 diabetes, or 126 after 2 hours of drinking, like equivalent of 2 Coca-Colas. But what's really striking as a doctor, and I've seen this, and I don't know if you've come up with this in your work, but people can have perfect blood sugars and still be wildly metabolically unhealthy.
Yeah,
and they can have perfect, even, never high, never over 85 fasting, never over 110 after a glucose load, even drinking 2 Coca-Colas, equivalent of glucose. They can have perfect sugar and be like really almost ready for having a heart attack. And that's because insulin will keep blood sugar normal until it can't. So by the time you actually see your blood sugar start to go to 90, 100, 110, your insulin has been working overtime to try to keep your sugar normal. And that insulin is not benign. That insulin makes you store fat. It makes you hungry. It causes inflammation. By secondary mechanisms, it's just got a whole cascade of horrible effects. And this phenomenon of hyperinsulinemia, or high insulin levels, is an epidemic. It's completely undiagnosed for the most part in America, except for a few doctors like me who are doing functional medicine or looking at insulin levels. It's quite striking. So I wonder what your perspective is on that. Because if we're just measuring continuous glucose measurements with a glucose monitor, and we're not measuring insulin, could we be falsely assured that there's no problem when in fact we're in big trouble?
100%. I mean, the day that somebody comes out with an insulin monitor, glucose monitors are dead, right? We're just using glucose because it's a good proxy for insulin.
I agree.
Yeah. It's not, again, like, because your glucose levels could be going up. I mean, there's like so many confounding variables. What I mean is that your glucose levels could be perfectly fine, but your insulin is going totally crazy. And we know from the science that your insulin levels start to rise 10 years before your glucose levels start to rise. So glucose monitors and you looking at your glucose spikes is very imperfect. That being said, that's what I base my work on, because that's what we have right now. And I think people really want to be able to see something visually. But yes, it's just a really bad proxy.
Exactly. So when you start seeing already these wild swings or changes in your blood sugar, it goes high after eating or high fasting, you already know you're in trouble.
Yeah, because it's been 10 years that your insulin has been high.
It's not the first stage. Right. It's not the first
Exactly.
stage. It's like a later stage.
Exactly.
So how do you know how far you are along the insulin resistance spectrum based on your work?
I mean, listen, really the best test to do is to do fasting insulin, as you said. The OMA-IR ratio is also really good. But to me, I think people also should strive to check in with themselves and just be like, okay, am I having cravings? Am I chronically fatigued? Do I have brain fog? Am I hungry all the time or 2 hours after eating? Do I have any sort of symptom that I wish wasn't there? And more often than not, you can link things back to this blood sugar or insulin level imbalance. So really, to me, it even comes down to just how happy you feel. Like, if you think you could feel better than you currently do, if you think you could wake up with a little bit more joy and feeling a bit better in your body, balancing your glucose levels is a non-negotiable. And I like using the image, Mark, of like a plane. So imagine your body is a plane and you're in charge of flying the plane, so keeping it healthy, but you have no idea how the plane works. So you're like in the cockpit and you're clueless. You're like, oh my God, how do I fly this thing? How do I keep my body, my brain healthy? Well, learning to balance your glucose levels is like learning about the most important lever in the cockpit. Like, if you know how to use this lever, you can more or less keep the plane in the air and not crash.
Yeah.
That's how I see glucose management. Because once you balance your glucose levels, so many things fall into place. Of course, it's not everything, but it's a damn important place to start.
That's great. So one of the things you talked about, and I think is really important, I think there's a lot of research on this. It's not just your experience or what you've gleaned from your study that you did, but what you eat when matters. So food sequencing has a big impact on your blood sugar. So if you eat certain things first or second, even if it's the same food, you swap out, like, let's say eating bread first versus like your chicken first, it's going to have a profound difference on your blood sugar. Can you talk about food sequencing, what it is and how it impacts blood sugar levels?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the first study that came out on this topic was quite fascinating. The scientists showed that if you eat the elements of a meal in a specific order, you can reduce the glucose spike of that meal by up to 75%. Okay,
Wow.
eating the same meal, which is mind boggling. And so the correct order is veggies first, then proteins and fats, then starches and sugars. And in my opinion, because I'm here to try to make things as easy as possible for people to start and pick up on, the most important thing to remember is try to have your veggies first and your carbs last. Like if you mix the proteins and the fats in the middle, like it's not a huge deal, but the veggies first thing is incredibly powerful. It really impacts your hunger levels. It makes you feel so much fuller for longer, reduces cravings after a meal. And the reason this works, Mark, is because the veggies contain fiber. And fiber, when it lands first in your stomach, has time to create that protective mesh onto the walls of your intestine and prevent essentially too many glucose molecules from then coming through into your bloodstream. It just makes that gut lining healthier and less porous. So that's a really wonderful hack to start with. It doesn't require you to change what you're eating, which is very, very cool. And you can start seeing the benefits. And so then, the next hack or the next principle is going to be easier to apply because you're going to feel better. And it becomes this virtuous cycle.
And so you know, food sequencing is so important, and I think protein, fat, veggies, fiber are all basically antidotes to sugar and
Yeah.
starch. To remember that. And when you're having any sugar and starch, like for example, you have an apple, have it with a spoon of almond butter or peanut butter, right? That
Hmm.
actually slows the glucose surge in your body.
And
Um,
let's talk about
when
fruit quickly, Mark. I want to say something interesting that I learned about fruit. So, the fruit that we see today, people often think, oh, I bought this piece of whole fruit at the supermarket, therefore it's natural, therefore it's good for me. Well, it turns out that a lot of the fruit that we eat today is actually, the consequence of thousands of years of human intervention and breeding to make them extra sweet, extra juicy, extra easy to eat, and contain less fiber. So, if you compare like a banana today to an ancestral banana, the ancestral banana is tiny. It's full of seeds, full of
Yeah,
fiber,
yeah,
not
it's a
very
little tiny
sweet.
little thing, right,
Yeah.
yeah.
So the fruit today, is super extra sweet. So we have to remember that it's been bred to be almost like a piece of dessert. But because of the fiber, it's still fine. The problem happens when you get rid of the fiber and you juice it all.
Yeah, that's right. It's like, fruit has its own matrix. Plus, also, fruit has a lot of fructose, which doesn't actually raise your blood sugar. So that's another tricky thing. You could be
Hmm.
drinking like having agave syrup and other kinds of pure fructose, and actually your blood sugar won't go up, but you'll be driving fat into your liver, causing fatty liver and some resistance,
And that's
inflammation.
another limitation,
Right.
right? Of focusing only on glucose because you forget that piece. But what's cool about fructose is that because it's always hand in hand in food with glucose, because it makes sucrose. When you learn to balance your glucose levels, naturally also the fructose reduces. As a consequence, because it's always bound to the glucose in sweet foods.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true. So when you wrote your first book, The Glucose Revolution, um, what were the things you learned from your readers about how they could impact their blood sugar and keep it in balance?
Well, what people told me the most was that changing their breakfast changed their entire life. So going from a sweet, starchy breakfast, granola, muesli, cereal that they thought was healthy, to what I call a savory breakfast, which is essentially just a breakfast that's not dessert, right? Because
Yeah,
that
dessert for
that
breakfast basically is what we have
exactly,
in the world mostly.
which is a complete fabrication and invention. We didn't used to have dessert for breakfast. We used to have whatever meats and potatoes or whatever we ate the rest of the time. The concept that breakfast should be sweet is an invention of the food industry, and it's very smart because sugary breakfast foods are very cheap and they're very addictive. So switching back to what we used to do, which is a savory breakfast, changed people's experience of themselves and of their lives so deeply. So if you're somebody who's had a sweet breakfast your whole life, you don't even know what it feels like to feel more like yourself and to not be controlled, by the swings of glucose. So people really reported to me that the savory breakfast was a cornerstone of them starting to feel better.
Yeah, that's huge. I used to go to this hotel all the time in New York that had a lot of Japanese business folks in there, and they had a Japanese breakfast just laid out, and it was amazing. Basically, you go get grilled salmon, miso soup, pickled vegetables, brown rice. It was like the best. It was like the best breakfast. It was a savory breakfast, and many other countries like in the Middle East, they have shashuka and all kinds of things which are more savory breakfasts. And I think those are way better for us because they don't cause this huge spike in the morning, which is the worst thing we can possibly do for our health. In fact, in terms of longevity, on a fasted state, having sugar is the worst thing you can do, or anything that turns to sugar, like a muffin or a bagel or French toast or pancakes. And having protein and fat, which is often in a savory breakfast, is the opposite. It actually helps you build muscle and actually improve the process of refeeding, which is when you activate all these secondary pathways for muscle protein synthesis and reducing inflammation and for actually increasing stem cell production, all kinds of amazing stuff that happens just as a result of having the right breakfast.
Yes. And on that topic, when you're having breakfast, when you're fasted and your system is really empty, actually, if you have sugar, then you're going to create a very, very big spike because of the emptiness of your system. And so when people ask, is intermittent fasting good for glucose levels? It's like, yes, but how you break your fast is going to be very important.
Absolutely.
So it's not just
a
matter
nobody
of
talks about that.
Yeah, because it's all this stuff about, just fast a bunch and you'll be fine. It's like, okay, fasting is fine, but if then you break your fast with a fruit smoothie, you're in trouble because your body's going to be suffering all the consequences of the big spike. So fasting is fine, but breaking your fast is very important to be doing it in a savory fashion, protein and fat, as you said.
So important. And I think people don't understand the importance of actually the breaking the fast or the refeeding process when it comes to fasting. Fasting is only part of the story. The refeeding is what activates all these secondary mechanisms that help you actually extend your life. So it's actually kind of a mistake to think it's intermittent fasting. It's both the intermittent fasting or time restricted eating and what you eat right after.
Interesting. So the refeeding process is what activates the pathways.
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely. For muscle protein synthesis, for stem cell production, for repair and healing. It's quite interesting. Yeah. So refeeding is such a key part. And then you kind of come upon that naturally just by doing the work you've done. So I wanted to talk to you about what happened when you wrote your new book, The Glucose Goddess Method, which is out now. Everybody should definitely get a copy. You did some research when writing that book. You conducted a 4-week study with about 2,700 people from 110 countries, which is impressive, to, I don't even know if I can name 110 countries, to test your method in a pilot experiment. So what's the Glucose Goddess Method, and what were the results from that pilot experiment that you did?
So as I was writing it, Mark, and the reason I wrote it is because my community and my readers were asking for it. And being a scientist, I couldn't resist the idea of actually, getting some survey data from people, some self-reported survey data to see how the method impacted them. So I put together, an early version of the Glucose Goddess Method, which at that point was just a PDF, a black and white PDF with like some wanky pictures of the recipes from my kitchen. It was not pretty, but it was the method. And I recruited almost 3,000 people from my Instagram, people who wanted to apply the hacks, people who really wanted to see change in their lives, but who had not been able to start before because they were lacking the guidance and the motivation. So I sent them the PDF. And we went through the 4 weeks together. And so week 1, we looked at savory breakfasts. So everybody in the experiment started having a savory breakfast instead of a sweet one in most cases. Then in week 2, we continued the savory breakfast and we added in a new hack, which is a vinegar drink before you have something starchy or sweet. Week 3, we continued the breakfast, the vinegar drink once a day. And we added a veggie starter to one of our meals a day. So that's just a big plate of veggies at the beginning of your meal. And then finally in week 4, we layered in movement. So 10 minutes of movement once a day after a meal. And this could be, just walking. It could be cleaning your home. It could be ice skating or whatever you wanted. And the rest of the time, apart from these 4 hacks, people could do whatever they wanted. They went about their day normally. They ate what they usually ate. They drank what they usually drank. So that's really important. And so at the end, I sent everybody a survey of how they did, how their symptoms improved. And here are the results I got. And I'll read out the numbers because they're really quite remarkable. And it was very easy for people to do this. It was not super highly restrictive. It was really, to me, it's like the on-ramp to steady glucose. So after the 4 weeks, here are the results. 90% of participants were less hungry. 89% reduced their cravings. 77% had more energy. 67% said they were happier. 58% were sleeping better. 58% of people who were struggling with their mental health said they saw improvements. 46% of people with skin problems saw improvements. 41% of people with diabetes improved it. And finally, 35% of people who had hormonal issues, PCOS, etc., improved their hormonal health. And my favorite stat of them all, I think, is that 99% of people said they would continue doing these hacks as part of their daily lives. So it was quite remarkable and, to me, really encouraging, because that means you can start and it doesn't have to be super hard.
Yeah, these are just 4 simple things, right? Eat a savory breakfast, have a little vinegar, eat veggies before your meal, and walk for 10 minutes after you eat.
I know.
It's pretty powerful.
It's simple, but if you're able to actually do it, then it can change things so much. And it sounds simple. It's like, oh, that's too simple, like whatever. No, actually doing that for 4 weeks consistently can transform how you feel and put you on a new path for your health. And I want to touch on weight loss, because to me, this is not, this is not a diet. The glucose guidance method is not it's not a diet. The number one point is not losing weight. But throughout this method, 38% of people lost weight without even trying, right? Without counting calories, without doing any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's key because, as you mentioned at the beginning of the episode, people with type 2 diabetes, they could be, sure, they could have a lot of fat in their body, but also they could not, right? So weight and health, there's a correlation there, but losing weight is not the number one thing you need to do for health. You need to fix some underlying issues. That's really the important thing.
That's so powerful. When people think it's complicated to fix this, it's really not. I mean, I think people
overcomplicate.
Are so overcomplicated, and I talked about the same principles for years, and people follow them and they see amazing results. And the data you shared was really staggering. Obviously, it wasn't a double-blind randomized controlled trial.
No, it was just
self-reported data, but it's pretty impressive data. We call it an observational trial. And when you implement these behaviors, it changes your biology very quickly. It doesn't take a long time. It's only 4 weeks, right? So let's break it down a little bit on each step. So savory breakfast, what does that mean? Why is it so important? What are your favorite savory breakfast recipes? Tell us actually how we do this.
Okay, so the principles for your savory breakfast are very easy. It's number 1, base it around protein. And when people think breakfast protein, they're like, oh my God, do I have to eat eggs every day? What a hassle. No, you can eat eggs. I love eggs. But you can have any type of protein. So maybe you have some leftover grilled salmon from your dinner last night. Maybe you have some turkey. Maybe you have some eggs. Maybe you have a nice yogurt. Maybe you have protein powder in a smoothie. Actually, there's a recipe in the bookmark that's inspired by one of your old school smoothie recipes from back in the blood sugar solution days.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because that was one of my favorite ones. Yeah, so that's one of my favorite recipes in the book. And there are 30 recipes per week to inspire you to actually get started. But my other favorite breakfast recipe, I think, is called Happy Halloumi. So it's just spinach and grilled halloumi, some chili, super easy. And I'm quite a lazy person when it comes to cooking, and I understand that in order to actually make these changes, it needs to be really simple. So all the recipes are 6 ingredients or less. They take 10 to 15 minutes to make maximum. Really, it's not like a complicated cookbook where you have to grocery shop for 6 hours and do a whole feast. These are recipes that you're only going to have to look at once, and then you'll know how to do them. They're so simple. That's the point. I want to teach people really easy steps. So that's week 1. That's savory breakfast. What's your favorite savory breakfast, Mark?
I mean, I love shushuka. It's one of my favorite breakfasts,
Yeah.
which is essentially a kind of Middle Eastern dish with like tomatoes and spices and so yummy. And then you put the eggs in, like you poach them and cook them in the oven, and it comes out all like hot and steamy. I love that. Um, I also love, like an avocado, fresh tomatoes, avocados cut up with olive oil on them and like a bunch of eggs. Sometimes, I'll do like a whole kernel rye bread with like tomato, a little mayo, and like kind of cooked eggs, like fried eggs on top with salt and pepper, maybe a little spicy sauce. Just really, really yummy stuff. So I typically have that. I also, have a shake often, which is a protein-based shake using goat whey, which I find really effective for getting the amount of protein I need to sort of create muscle protein synthesis. As you get older, you get anabolic resistance where it's hard to build muscle. So I make sure I get a good dose there. But that's my favorite stuff, and it changes everything. Like when you on a fasted state have a savory or protein breakfast with fat and veggies, your whole day is different. Your energy is different. Your cravings are different. You want different stuff. Your brain is clearer. You don't go through these crashes in the morning where, around 10, 11 o'clock, you're looking for something sweet or, your energy crashes. So you're kind of in this virtuous cycle when you do that. And it's such an easy thing to do. And it's also biologically so sound. I mean, it's actually how to optimize our biological system. So that's my favorite.
And to your point about your favorite recipes, I hope that people, open the method and they find these recipes that become their staples, because that's the best outcome, that you find 3-4 recipes that you love that you can just keep coming back to, that are really, really easy. It's about creating those habits and just making sure that becomes part of your life. And so savory breakfast is protein, fat, fiber if you can. And then importantly, you can have starches for taste, right? But they shouldn't be the center of your breakfast. And then finally, and probably most importantly, nothing sweet except whole fruit if you want for taste. That is the equation for the savory breakfast. That's going to really change how you feel. And that's week 1.
And eating the fruit at the end, right? Not at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yep. If you can. Yeah, that's great. That's even better. Yeah.
You start with fruit, you don't get in trouble. So tell us about the vinegar, because there's so much talk about vinegar and apple cider vinegar and, why it's great for you. And I think, what is the science about this? Is there any science? Is it just a kind of a folklore or natural medicine kind of recommendation? When should you consume it? What kind should you have? How do you incorporate vinegar? So talk about vinegar, because it's sort of a weird one. It's like, what do we mean vinegar? Okay, I get the savory breakfast, I get the veggies, I get the exercise, but like vinegar is kind of a weird one.
I know it is kind of a weird one. And when I first came across the studies, I also was quite surprised, because even though vinegar has been, culturally around for a very long time, it was like, does it really have this deep of an impact on our glucose levels? Well, interestingly, there are a good amount of clinical trials on adding just 1 tablespoon of vinegar once a day, either in the morning or before a meal, and we see significant impact on glucose spike and insulin release. And so scientists were like, how is this happening? Like, why is this just, this common food? What is it actually doing? Well, it turns out that vinegar contains acetic acid, and acetic acid does 2 really cool things. One, it acts on our alpha amylase enzyme, which is the one that's in charge of breaking down starches into glucose. And it slows down the action of alpha amylase, therefore slows down how quickly glucose molecules are arriving in your bloodstream. And second, Yes, acetic acid goes to your muscles and tells your muscles to make glycogen faster and more abundantly than usual. So soaking up glucose from the bloodstream and turning it to glycogen. And so those two very simple things mean that if you have a vinegar drink before your meal of the day that's highest in starches and sugars, maybe you're having pasta for dinner, maybe you're having like a cookie in the afternoon. If you have this, you're going to be able to still get all the pleasure from the carbs with less of an impact and less creation of that cravings roller coaster. Because the problem when we eat something sweet, we do it because it gives us pleasure, it gives us dopamine in the brain. But then inadvertently, we often then kick off that blood sugar roller coaster for the rest of the day. And so vinegar is one small tip that you can add that can help you counteract that. And so in week 2 of the method, I teach people lots of different ways of having it in water, in tea, in mocktails, as dressings, to try to add that ingredient in so you have that tool in your toolbox for when you need it.
So the vinegar basically inhibits the ability of the mouth to digest the sugars and starches.
Alpha amylase is inhibited. Yes.
Right. So in the mouth, you have enzymes as well as your gut, and it inhibits that alpha amylase, which is very fascinating. So you kind of have to take it before you eat.
Yes, before you eat. Ideally, in the studies, it's about 20 minutes before you eat. But also, it seems that acetic acid might actually just slow down gastric emptying. So just slow down how quickly food goes from stomach to intestine. So it has all these different pathways that it activates. And overall, in the studies, it shows a reduction in glucose spikes of up to 30%. And a reduction in insulin secretion of up to 20%. So it's pretty powerful for just 1 tablespoon of this cheap thing most of us have in our kitchen. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be just apple cider.
Yeah. It
can be any type.
Red wine vinegar, white vinegar.
Yep. Actually, I'm really liking white vinegar these days. I love ACV and apple cider vinegar, but the white vinegar is kind of like, it has a different texture to it, which I'm quite enjoying today. But yeah, any vinegar works. And you can also have it as a dressing on your food.
And white vinegar is great because white vinegar, actually, you can use it if you have a burnt pot. My mother taught me this. You put white vinegar in the pot and you boil it on the stove, and the vinegar just gets all the burnt stuff off the pot.
Oh, cool. That's amazing. I'll have to try that.
It's great. Yeah, it's great.
And it's been used for centuries. You know, in the 18th century... In the 18th century, Mark, they used to give vinegar teas to people with type 1 diabetes. So we've known culturally that vinegar is something that can be used for diabetes. And, you know, in countries like Iran, apple cider vinegar has been made for just generations and generations. And people know it as a health promoting ingredient. But only now today do we actually understand the mechanism. And that's what I love so much about these hacks too, is that yes, today we have the modern science evidence for explaining how they work, but actually culturally, they've been around for a very long time.
It's incredible. Yeah, vinegar's been around for a while. and should you take it like a tablespoon before every meal, or just if you're having a carbohydrate meal, or?
You do it once a day. Mostly, the most effective time to take it would be before a high carb meal. So that's the best time to take it. But otherwise, you know, even if you take it, for example, first thing in the morning, some studies show that just taking it in the morning also has a long-term impact. So any time is fine. And in the method, as long as you have 1 tablespoon a day, you do it whenever. But the most effective time is before a high carb meal. So if I want to have my favorite chocolate cake, that's a good time to have it.
So I'm in Italy right now. So if I wanted to have a little pasta, I would just have like a teaspoon of vinegar or a tablespoon of vinegar beforehand.
In some water. You could even have, so in Italy, you know, they have antipasti, which is, again, like culturally the veggies first kind of tradition. Right. Yeah. And so put some vinegar on there and you're taking off 2 hacks in one, and you're doing the glucose goddess method perfectly from Italy.
There you go. Your veggie starter is the next 4th one. So it's really the fiber that has the biggest impact from the veggie. That's why you use that, right?
Yeah, so fiber is remarkable, and we don't get nearly as much fiber as we need to get. And so in week 3 of the method, we do something very simple. We add a plate of vegetables to the beginning of one of our meals. So most people do that before lunch or before dinner instead of before breakfast, because that's a lot of veggies in the morning. And so by doing this, you're really harnessing the power of the fiber in the veggies. And fiber she's a superwoman. Like, she's so wonderful, amazing, and we need more of her in our lives. And she does a few amazing things. First of all, she is going to coat the upper part of your intestine. And as I said, prevent too many glucose molecules from coming through to your bloodstream too quickly. And second, fiber feeds your gut bacteria, which is also very, very important and healthy. And by having the veggies at the beginning of the meal, that's when you're going to be able to get the most power out of them. And the antipasti is a really good example of that being already culturally something we've been doing for a long time. And I'm French. And in France, we have crudité, which is raw veggies at the beginning of a meal. Again, we've been doing this. People have known this for a long time, but we've lost touch with these very key, straightforward principles that are really important to helping our health. So week 3, a veggie starter once a day. And there are no studies on exactly the right amount to have. From my experience, it seems that if your veggie starter makes up about 30% of your meal, that's a really good thing to aim for. And the veggies can be raw, they can be cooked, they can be dressed, for example, with a vinegar dressing as well, to, tick off 2 hacks in one. I have lots of wonderful recipes in the book, like my favorite French asparagus recipe, my mom's slow-cooked leeks, we have crispy kale, we have tomatoes with yogurt dressing, like lots of simple 6-ingredient or less kind of thing. And so that's week 3. And at that point, you're doing the savory breakfast, the vinegar, the veggie starter. This is where most of the participants in the study told me that everything started to change really profoundly. When you get to the end of that second week and you start the veggie starter, you feel like a completely new person. And again, it wasn't hard because you could do whatever you wanted the rest of the time. You just added these principles like gentle giants and your glucose slowly steadied. Inflammation goes down, hormones rebalance, you're less hungry, you sleep better. It's really transformative, and I'm so excited that it's been so well received. So yeah.
Well, it's great. You make such complicated science into these practical hacks and tips that everybody can use that are not that complicated, and people can understand them and make them as regular habits, which I really love.
Thanks, Mark.
The last bit was moving after you eat, and this is really interesting because people often eat dinner and then they go sit on the couch and watch TV, right? It's absolutely the worst thing you could do. And my grandfather was from a family who had lots of heart attacks in their 50s, bypasses, heart attacks, all kinds of stuff. He didn't really get it until he was in his 80s, and he got some angina then. And what was fascinating was that he was deaf, so he was a physical laborer most of his life, throwing newspapers on the New York Times truck. But at night after dinner, he always liked to feed the alley cats who live in New York City. And he would go out with scraps of food and he would find the alley cats. And he would just walk the streets of New York after dinner. And he was super thin and healthy and was doing handstands at 80 years old. So I think that moving thing is a thing. And now we have the science behind it. So can you talk about the science behind why moving after eating is such a critical thing to do?
Yes. And again, I love that story and I love cats. So I was thinking maybe I should do that when I'm 80 and go feed all the alley cats. I'm probably going to end up that way, to be perfectly honest. So listen, movement, we all know we should exercise more. We all know that exercise is good for us. But when is the best time to do it? And what is the best way to start? So from the studies, just 10 minutes of walking or of light movement after a meal can help reduce the glucose spike of your meal significantly. And why is that? Because every cell in your body uses glucose for energy, okay? And that also goes for your muscles. Your muscles, when they contract, they need energy to do so. And the first place they will look is in your bloodstream for extra glucose they can use and burn and contract. And so we can use this to our advantage. And so here's the hack. 10 minutes of movement after one meal a day within about 90 minutes of the end of your meal. So you don't have to get up and immediately do a bunch of push-ups. You can wait a little bit. 90 minutes is when the glucose spike will reach its maximum. And so you want to move and use your muscles before that so you can capture some of that extra glucose and lower the spike. Now, what can you do? Okay, so you can walk, feed the alley cats. We love that. You can also do even simpler stuff to get started. For example, if you're in the habit of sitting on your couch after dinner, you can still do that. But as you're sitting on the couch, How about you start doing some calf raises? So you push up onto the balls of your feet, up and down. You do that for 10 minutes. That activates a muscle in your calf called the soleus muscle, which is surprisingly good at soaking up glucose from your bloodstream. And that's a muscle we use for walking. So again, this walking connection. You can also grab like a big bottle of water, do some bicep curls while you're watching Netflix. Of course, you can like clean your apartment, do the dishes, do the laundry. You can also do intense stuff. You can go ice skating, whatever floats your boat. But those 10 minutes are going to be so powerful to help your body use some of that fuel you just ate. And most of us give our body too much fuel, and that's where the problems start happening. And so your muscles really become your greatest allies in your journey to steady glucose. So that's the hack. Week 4, 10 minutes of movement, whatever you want. And by the end of it all, you have these 4 very simple yet profoundly transformative new habits in your day-to-day. And then you're a new person, and you can go after your dreams and follow your passion and do things you've always wanted to do, and be really proud of yourself.
I love that. And that's such a simple set of things that I think people should follow just from listening to this. They should definitely get your book, which is out now. It's called The Glucose Goddess Method, a 4-week guide to cutting cravings, getting your energy back, and feeling amazing. Is there anything else you want people to know that you've learned in this process of being the glucose goddess before we go?
Yes, I think I want to say something. And this, I want to share this because for me, it was just the beginning of my healing. So after I broke my back and I had all these mental health issues for almost a decade, I was super lost, and I was confused about what I needed to do to feel good in the morning. I felt like my body was this black box. I felt like my body was almost like an enemy, because I couldn't understand it. I didn't know how to fix it. And I felt like it was working against me, and I was getting all this brain fog. And I was just like, why are you doing this to me, body? And then as I learned about glucose and the science, I got an insight, which is that the symptoms that I had been feeling for all these years, they were actually messages. They were actually my body trying so hard to communicate with me. That brain fog, that exhaustion, those pimples, that was my body's language, trying to be like, Jessie, SOS, glucose spikes, help. So next time, and even, the fat gain on our body, often your body puts on fat because it's trying to protect you and it's trying to keep you alive, right? The more fat you're able to put on, the longer you'll be protected against type 2 diabetes. So we just have to switch a little bit how we think about it all. Your body is trying to save you. Your body is trying to keep you alive. Symptoms are messages. And I hope that, on this journey of steady glucose, you can get to where I got, which is realizing my body is my partner and creating a connection again, a friendship, between me and my body. And I have a cookie, but I go for a walk afterwards. So we have an agreement.
I think you have to walk 4
symptoms
miles
are messages.
To work off one chocolate chip cookie, though.
For sure. No, not 10 minutes. But we can put in place these easy principles that help us reconnect with our body and create more of a partnership instead of this black box thing.
Thank you for what you do, Jessie. This is such important work, and you make it so simple and clear for people. You kind of learn the hard way yourself. You've translated that into your life's work. It's just beautiful to see. Thank you for being on the podcast. All of you who are listening, if you've loved this podcast, please share with your friends and family on social media. Leave comments. Have you learned to regulate your blood sugar? Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next week on The Doctor's Pharmacy. If you loved that last video, you're going to love the next one. Check it out here.
We've realized that it's not about drugs killing cancer. It's about our bodies taking care of itself and wiping out those cancers. So immunotherapy, which is what you were just bringing up, is an entirely new approach of enhancing our own body's defenses.